Hi, welcome to the Regenerate Media podcast. I'm your host, Skylar Perkins, and today we're going to be talking about tariffs.
Could be the third straight day of major losses after President Trump announced sweeping tariffs last week.
Trade tensions between the United States and China continue to mount.
The United States launched a trade war against Canada, their closest partner and ally, their closest friend.
So, what's the deal with tariffs? As always, today we'll be looking through the lens of a regenerative economy, which concerns not only the environment and the way that the economic system interacts with the environment, but also the cycles that society and our political and economic systems go through.
It's an honor to be speaking here today as the 79th Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. Maybe some of you have an interest in this. President Trump's tariff policies have begun the process of reorienting our international economic relations.
So the interesting thing is this is really an enormous change in our political and economic order. Starting sometime in the mid-20th century, the U.S. began to really dominate the global landscape, really pushing for free market dynamics. So trade liberalization. This means a reduction in tariffs, a reduction in trade barriers, and a reduction of sort of state-sponsored monopoly. Free trade was really a romantic notion during, what you could call the post-feudal era, the Enlightenment era in the 1700s. So at this time, progressive economists like Adam Smith were really advocating for freedom from monarchs and state monopolies. Of course, this carried through to the American Revolution and economic thinking during the 1800s and 1900s. But it wasn't until the mid-1900s that this really became an international economic order. So throughout time, there is an extent to which empires produce an international order, which is a system of rules and norms that extend across political boundaries. So, for example, in the ancient Roman Empire, there were unified legal systems, a unified currency. Trade routes were protected militarily. This extends to infrastructure. There were, networks of roads and ports that facilitated this international order. But trade liberalization is more unique to modern empires, the British Empire, the international order defined by the United States. So after sort of all of the destruction and fragmentation that was a result of the world wars, the world came together and created the Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, at least on the surface, this agreement was really about sort of like working together, integrating our economies, opening up barriers to trade, and liberalizing that cooperative capacity of the world. Harry Dexter White, the chief U.S. negotiator at Bretton Woods, said, the absence of a high degree of economic cooperation among the leading nations will inevitably result in economic warfare that will be every bit as destructive as any shooting war. Dean Acheson, the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, said, what we won in the war was the opportunity to prove that a system of free cooperation could work. But the reality is that these institutions resulting from Bretton Woods were really much more favorable to the United States. So, the World Bank and the IMF were headquartered in Washington, D.C., and structured so that voting power was based on how much money we were giving in. So the U.S. really had a lot of control over these international institutions. We developed the currency, the U.S. currency, as the main reserve currency. And of course, the U.S. emerged from World War II with a much stronger industrial base than many of these other countries. And so early on, this approach to economic integration really created a demand for U.S. companies and also opened up resources for companies around the world. So, for example, any given nation, take Iran, might want to nationalize their oil in order to protect their security interests or find some, who knows, equitable distribution mechanism for oil. But it was in the U.S. interest that those boundaries to trade were opened up and that natural resources and other resources around the world were privatized. Here I'd like to introduce Herman Daly, who is really the founder of ecological economics. So in 2004, Daly spoke at a hearing of the Senate Democratic Policy Committee and really expressed this notion that we should be seeking internationalization as opposed to global integration.
So I'd like to make a distinction, if I may, that I think is very important between internationalization and globalization. Internationalization refers to the increasing importance of international trade, international relations, treaties, protocols, alliances, and so forth. International, of course, means between or among nations. But the basic unit of community and policy remains the nation, even as relations among and between nations become more and more critical and important. That's internationalization. I don't know of anyone who's against that. That's inevitable, that's there, that's important, we have to do it. Globalization, I think, is something rather different. It refers to the global economic integration of many formerly national economies into one global economy. How does that happen? By free trade, mainly by free capital mobility, and also by free or easy or uncontrolled migration. So it is the effective erasure of national boundaries for economic purposes.
Daly was talking about this during a time when this trade liberalization could be seen as being to the U.S. advantage. But there's sort of a murky line between what is in the advantage of the United States and what is in the advantage of corporations based in the United States. Economic entities were able to get their way, and as sort of documented history shows now, if this didn't occur purely in the economic playing ground, then the U.S. would go as far as to intervene in foreign governments.
The international trading system consists of a web of relationships, military, economic, political. One cannot take a single aspect in isolation. This is how President Trump sees the world, not as a zero-sum game, but as interlinkages that can be reordered to advance the interest of the American people.
In Guatemala in 1954, President Arbenz sought to redistribute land to landless peasants, and apparently this included land owned by the United Fruit Company, a U.S. corporation. So the U.S. saw this as sort of a creeping socialism and a threat to free market dynamics. As CIA overthrew the president of Guatemala. In 1973, the president of Chile, Salvador Allende, nationalized copper mines. The U.S. was then part of a military coup by Pinochet, which reopened Chile to foreign capital. And further, particularly in Africa in the 80s and 90s, there was this notion of using finance through the World Bank and the IMF to liberalize African economies, gaining access to mining, oil, timber, etc. So now, why after all these years is Trump giving up, apparently, on this system that has been so important for us and given us such power around the world? Well, the answer is quite confusing. There is a legitimate question as to whether this really is in the U.S. interest at all. But it is important to recognize that broad changes are occurring in the trajectory of the U.S. economy. So there was this period where liberalization was leading to U.S. expansion. And at least for the first several decades after World War II, the U.S. was a net exporter of goods. So we were selling more than we were buying. Now, for the last, I don't know if it's 40 years, the U.S. has really become a consumer country. So we're getting all of these goods from around the world for cheap, and we're taking in a lot more than we're selling and exporting. The power of the dollar, our debt, and our control of supply chains are all shifting. So it was once the case that we had great influence all over Latin America, both economically and politically. Now it's China launching the Belt and Road Initiative. Now it's BRICS, this alternative trade bloc that is arguing in favor of an alternative to the US currency. And of course, militarily, we're struggling with determining where the boundary is, where our allegiances are. So, Ukraine and the Middle East are examples of this. As a population, we've sort of decided that, we went too far with Iraq. So having these open borders and having this sort of complex economy that sourced from all around the world was good when we had this power around the world, when we had that leverage, and when we could, maintain sufficient control to sort of ensure the stability of our supply chains. As the economy grew, we really, we not only grew out, we also grew up. So our economy now is really, like based in California, you could think of. We have the tech sector. We sort of sit atop the global economy in this way. It's creating products that are at the higher stages of supply chain rather than those lower stages. But now, what if China actually challenged us and we went into some conflict? We're not going to be in a secure place if they are manufacturing all our computer chips and if the US does not have sufficient economic resources at the base of its economy. And so this was sort of a major influence for Trump's thinking, as I understand. Trump may be doing this out of a sense of fear. The writing is on the wall. We need to retreat on some level, right? But it also provides a very interesting case study. So much of our economic and political thought sort of assumes this indefinite expansion, this indefinite growth. Well, what is the correct way to handle decline? So, of course, we see these systems throughout time go through these cycles of growth and expansion, followed by retreat. And, we see this in nature. We see perennial plants that grow and expand to compete for sunlight before dropping their leaves and returning their resources to the roots for winter. Of course, we see this also with past empires who expand and liberalize trade and conquer new lands and create rules and norms for systems that extend beyond their initial boundaries before they eventually are forced to let go of their frontiers, of the reaches of their power.
The United States also provides reserve assets, serves as a consumer of first and last resort, and absorbs excess supply in the face of insufficient demand in other countries' domestic models. This system is not sustainable.
over time on this podcast, we'll talk more and more about how institutions can operate gracefully across these cyclical dynamics in political and economic systems. So, as you can imagine, there are various perspectives from all over the world dealing with the current international order, from developed and developing nations, competing, rising and falling nations, from those interested in ecosystem, food systems, finance, whatever it is. Tariffs are one way that economic systems can retreat from being global to more local. And at the very least, we can say, when we're talking in the U.S. interest, this is not necessarily a bad thing to be retreating from this totally integrated system. It's natural, it's going to happen. But as Ray Dalio says, what really matters is how it occurs.
I think it's just a function of how well they're handled. It's a reality that it's a desire to bring in tax revenue from that. It's a reality that we would like to build manufacturing and jobs here. This is a reality. That's how that's done, whether that's done in a practical way, whether that's done in a stable way, whether that's done with quality negotiations in which that's a mutual problem, or whether that's done in a chaotic and disruptive way that produces great conflict, makes all the difference in the world.
Again, on the next episode, we'll talk more about the environment and trade and the possibility for a world order based on ecological principles. So for now, thanks for tuning in to the Regenerate Media podcast, and I hope we've helped set the stage for understanding what's taking place in our current political systems.